Okay, this is ego-utilitarianism. We're coming with the third installment of the series on the relative theory of value. So just a brief recap. Um, Utility is the usefulness in satisfying objectives or goals, not happiness. Happiness is only an emotional indicator. Value of a good is the marginal utility extracted by the consumer from consuming that marginal unit of the good. The value of the good is derived from the consumer's ability to use the good in order to satisfy an objective. Therefore, it's like the chemical reaction example. Value is a reaction between a good and the consumer. So here's the theorem. The relative theory of value states that the relative value of a good equals R. The R, we can call it the relative value of a good function, R, is dependent upon a specific good and a specific consumer. And you can represent that in variables called G and C. So R is a function of G and C, in other words. The relative value of a good is a function of a specific good and a specific consumer. Once you know those two things, a perfectly omniscient mind with perfect reasoning skills can determine the relative value of the good. So note here, C accounts for all conditions and goals of the consumer. In other words, C, consumer, if you say it is the C function, the consumer is dependent upon goals, abilities, and external conditions. So that means you know all three of these things. They might be implicit functions of something else, but just in general, if the perfect reasoning mind with all information knew these three things, he could perfectly determine the consumer, at least the important part of the consumer that's relevant in determining R, the relative value of a good. Okay, so notice that C is not a subjective object, while a goal, one of its determinants, is a subjective variable. The other two variables are non-subjective, abilities and external conditions, thus making C only partially determined by the mind. And remember from my definition set that classifies C as a non-subjective object. It kind of makes intuitive sense, right? Your body is it's the same thing as acknowledging the barrier between the mind and the body, right? Your mind can only do so much in terms of controlling its body. It cannot determine. You couldn't dunk a ball just because your mind, right? You have to you abide by the physical laws, and physics. So you have to train your body before you can dunk, and even then, you're going to have natural ability, a natural talent that limits you. Your potential's limited, right? You can't do everything. You can't jump to the moon. So again, your mind, once its power is limited, if your mind's limited to controlling something, that something it's controlling is not subjective. It becomes non-objective because it's only partially determined by the mind. Any restriction on the mind, any restriction from an external thing other than the mind, makes it non-subjective. Okay, so replacing consumer in the function, you see here, we're evaluating the value of a good from the consumer, because really that's all we care about. A good's purpose is to be consumed toward an objective, right? So a producer isn't really concerned with the good, right? He's concerned with the revenue he gets from the good. So it's trivial to analyze the relative value of a good from that perspective, since the producer is essentially a consumer, and he's also a consumer once he gets the revenue. When he goes to spend the revenue he gets from selling that good. So, and then the analysis is the same from there for him. He becomes a consumer, therefore you can analyze his consumption patterns and stuff. So it all makes logical sense so far, right? Okay, so let's start. Now that I've established the relative theory of value, right? Relative theory of value is dependent on two variables. Once you give those two, any third party perspective can evaluate R if he's smart enough, right? Given he's smart enough and he knows enough info about about these two variables. Or if it's given to him, if he has perfect logical reasoning, he can deduce the relative value of the good. Okay, so that value of the good's out there. It's something that's, you can say, that's kind of suspended in reality, or it exists in reality, not determined, not completely, at least completely determined by the mind. Okay, but your mind can attempt to comprehend, so it's an object. Okay, so let's look at the labor theory of value. Let's compare and contrast, and see what weaknesses this has that the relative theory of value can compensate for, if not transcend in every other category. So I claim the relative theory of value should be consistent enough. I mean, the detail might be rough, and someone else can actually better refine my definition, since I virtually came up with this analysis in the last 2 days. I mean, I've hammered out the rough idea for a little while, but actually doing this outline took me about the better part of a day, mostly today. So, okay, the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value, LTV, is a heterodox. I think heterodox actually means unorthodox. It's kind of a euphemism for unorthodox. I'm not sure, but who cares? And a heterodox economic theory of value that argues the economic value of a good or service is determined by the total amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it, right? So all you care about is how much labor input was into it. Doesn't matter the commodities or raw materials that went into it. The only resource of concern is labor, which is obviously, intuitively, you kind of want to reject it, especially if you're a supplier. you know, I know their reasoning. I know the communist reasoning. You can always trace some labor to any raw material, and it's just a rationalization that's fallacious. So at present, this confidence is usually associated with Marxian economics, although it is also used in theories of earlier classical economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And that's, who can blame them? They were the forefathers, so they're bound to make mistakes. So anyways, let's see my critique. So criticism of the LTV. I claim that it's relative value, it's relative value that creates labor, not the other way around. So it's not the labor that creates the value, the relative value, or, in the old definition sense, objective value, but it's the relative value that generates the labor to produce it. The goal of the supplier is to maximize profit. Therefore, he compares the value of the resources used to produce his product to what he believes he can sell his product for, in order to determine how much he will produce. In economics, he will produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and this is just classical economic analysis. But you see here that his incentive, the relative value, actually determines if he'll produce or not, right? Whenever they produce, it's always with an expectation to make a profit. They think that whenever they produce, they think that that good is worth more to the market than the resources used, the cost of the resources used to produce it. And so that dictates what labor he's willing to spend for, right? I mean, and this is kind of like a case of the unseen too. I mean, what you don't see is all the times that a producer chose not to produce something, and that's all the time, right? Every time we do something, every time we produce something, we forego our opportunity cost of producing another thing. And so all that labor that would have went into that, essentially that labor wasn't worth, or all the resources, including labor, weren't worth the production venture. Therefore, you never see these goods come to market, and that's the reason why relative value creates actually labor. It's not the other way around. So all production cost. So my second point is all production cost is a sunk cost relative to the consumer. Okay, so the labor theory of value does nothing to explain value from the perspective of the consumer, right? And it's the most important perspective, because he's the one who's going to utilize the good. He's the one that's going to consume it. no other person is going to consume the good, right? I mean, resellers or resellers, producers want to sell it, resellers want to sell it, and they're not their end goal. They don't have any objective for the good. Their objective is the revenue to buy another good. So that good had no value, in at least relatively less value than another good in satisfying their objectives. So you can see that the labor theory of value is virtually worthless, because what we care about is the consumer's perspective. And from his perspective, whatever labor went into the product is a sunk cost. He doesn't care, right? As whatever labor went into, he doesn't care. All he care about is the price that he can buy it for versus the utility he's extracted from it. He thinks he can extract from it. He compares the two, and if the utility the expected utility he expects to extract from it is greater than the price, he's going to do it. He does not care in any way, at least directly, how much labor went into it, right? I mean, the producer does, and so but he doesn't care. I mean, and it disappears somewhere along the line of reselling, right? I mean, at some point, if you think about reselling, things are used and sold at garage sales. At that point, the labor is so far removed. I mean, I know it takes labor to put it up for sale or whatever. It becomes less significant, in other words. But from the perspective of a consumer, it's relatively worthless, right? And by relatively, I mean comparatively. Okay, so energy theory of value is more comprehensive, right? Since energy is the ability to do work or work itself in physics, right? So to do labor, for a human body to do labor, it needs chemical energy, food, in other words, chemical potential energy. So all work is energy, and all energy is virtually work. I mean, they're virtually the same, if not the same. So, like, the ability to accomplish objectives is work. It takes work, which is energy, and vice versa. So, I mean, an energy theory, like, that's why we value oil so much, because its ability to do work for us. It can spin a generator and create electrical energy, or we can burn it to create heat, to turn a turbine, or whatever. I mean, you can see everything is energy in physics, almost. You can even matter's energy. So food's energy, matter's energy, because our body breaks it down and uses the energy and the bonds of matter to create ATP, and thus we're able to move our muscles. Okay, so next point is the quality of labor, right? It takes the labor theory of value does not distinguish between quality of labor whatsoever. An example of this is the same education is different for intelligent and stupid people, right? The inherent ability of people, intelligence, right? It's like their ability to utilize something, right? So the ability to utilize knowledge and capital is what distinguishes labor, and labor theory of value does not take this into account. Okay, so like take a fishing net. I think this has to do more with this point, but I created it, copied and pasted to the wrong thing. So in general, some methods are more efficient than others in producing goods. Therefore, when comparing superior and inferior methods, you'll come to a paradox that the outputs are the same in terms of value. So for instance, like here, okay, no, actually it did pertain to here. So let's go back to the fishing net example. A fishing net is capital, right? It's a capital good. It's a good that's used to not for consumption, but actually for a means of production. So it's a good created as a means of further production, not end consumption. So you don't extract. Actually, you do extract marginal utility, because your objective here is to produce, but it's a different type of good. I mean, it might be subcategory it might be different. It might be subcategory, but there's a category called capital goods. Okay, so they are consumed. So I guess they are a type, they're subset of goods. So take a fishing net, right? I mean, So let's take these two respects. Two guys, they're both aware. They both know how to make fishing nets. Let's say all else equal, right? But one just decides on a coin toss to make a fishing net to catch fish. So they're both of their objectives are to catch fish, as much fish as possible, highest quality fish as possible. All those implicit things filled in. So one decides to, on a coin flip, one decides to create a net to catch fish. The other just decides to just jump into whatever body of water they're both fishing in and start grabbing fish, right? So you see here that just the valuation, so obviously, let's say all things equal, the law of large numbers takes in and over the long run, the guy who created the net, assuming that the net's effective, he'll catch more fish, and the other guy will catch relatively less fish, comparatively less fish. So when you compare those two outputs, let's say 100 fish to a 10, right? So the guy using net catches 100, the other guy that's not using net catches 10. The labor theory of value puts equal, it equates it. It equates the outputs. So yeah, then you get a contradiction, right? 100 fish equals 10 fish, contradiction. So something's wrong with the labor theory of value. So that's kind of like a funny way to prove it, to at least show paradoxical, if not a genuine contradiction. So in general, some methods are more efficient than others in producing goods, which is kind of like a segue from this. Therefore, when comparing superior and inferior methods, you'll come to a paradox that the outputs are the same in terms of value. So that's just what I explained. So the LTV doesn't take into account the quality or method of labor, right? Very simple versions of this paradox can be presented: producing nothing with your labor, or worse, destroying goods with your labor. So like economists like to use digging holes and filling it back up, right? Nothing was produced, but labor was expended. Therefore, it should be positive. So again, you come to a contradiction that 0 is greater than 0, right? Which is contradictory, and something's wrong with your definitions or theory. Or at worst, destroying goods with your labor, right? Imagine you expend your labor in taking a good that's valuable to market and just smashing it, right? You've created a bad. You've created a negative value to society. Therefore, negative equals positive, and you get another contradiction. So either way, they're all forms of the same contradiction, all same paradox, where the labor doesn't take into account the quality of labor, right? Okay. Let's give labor theory of value some credit, right? It actually has some power in predicting price, right? Because obviously labor is an input. So let's take silver as a byproduct of other industrial metals, right? So due to rarity, like when miners mine for other metals, industrial metals, their prime objective is actually the industrial metal, not the silver, not the precious metals itself. It's usually a byproduct, and just based on scarcity, I mean, it's the same amount of labor. So divided by if you see the labor, if you see the product per labor unit, it kind of has some explanatory power. Something maybe the subjective theory of value doesn't. I mean, in some ways, it's only relevant because labor is an input, a resource, which has a cost, which is a relevant factor in decision making for the producer. But as far as value, especially to consumer, worthless. Okay, so the distinction between value and price. Okay, maybe this should have gone to the portion of the subjective theory of value, but let me go into it here. So here's the distinction between value and price. Value is again marginally utility extracted for so the ability to satisfy a consumer's need to fulfill an objective, and price is actually something that's negotiated by the seller and buyer, right? So price, or negotiated or a market clearing price, should lie between the subjective price, the subjective valuation of the seller and subjective valuation of buyer. More precisely, above the subjective valuation of the seller and below the subjective valuation of the buyer, right? In order for a transaction to take place. The marginal unit would have the same value whether or not the good was scarce or abundant at that point in consumption. Okay, so value has to do with a person. So usually when you get into debate with collectivists or communists, they will always find a way to rationalize this into some kind of action and call it labor, right? So they'll point to some, you know, some human desire, some human action that actually has to produce the good, and they'll attribute all the value, no matter what the quality of labor is, no matter what the quality of the raw materials were, and just encapsulate it into the labor, all the labor inputs that went into that thing, and that's what you usually get when you get into debates with a communist who's arguing the labor theory value. But for all these reasons above, the labor theory value is invalid, if not just plain out contradictory. Okay, so this will do it for the criticism of the labor theory of value with respect to the relative theory of value. Not sure I referenced the relative theory of value much with respect to the criticism, but so next presentation I'll get into the subjective theory of value, and then maybe on a last part I'll sum up my conclusions. Thanks for viewing. If you have any comments or criticisms, leave it in the comment section below. If you can, subscribe, like, dislike, whatever, but give me some input. I mean, and don't troll. I'm just going to ignore trolls. If you're, and think about your objections before you present them. Make sure they're well thought out and they reference my definition set. And if it's logically inconsistent, you can show it almost quantitatively, if not just in a general form of functions or something. Okay, thanks for viewing.